So, Claire,
Hey.
normally, when we talk about queer history, or at least here at .fm, so far it's always been like people and events
And things.
and the occasional like location.
That's right.
But, something else that's pretty important for history is like technology changes,
And cinema.
and that has pretty massive impacts on things.
Many, many massive impacts on things. It makes us more connected. It makes us more together. Or we can develop coalitions. All the things. It's a wonderful thing.
You're listening to .fam.
Welcome to .fm. I'm your host, Danielle Gonzalez.
I'm Claire.
And I am so excited for today's episode because we have a special guest today. I've been looking forward to having him on this podcast since we started the podcast. So please welcome the expert in all things queer television, Matt Baume.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. A pleasure to be here.
Hi, Matt.
Thank you for coming on.
Yay.
This is so exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. Very excited to talk. As maybe you can guess, I like talking about TV. So I will jump into any opportunity.
I like listening about TV. I've been a fan of your YouTube channel for years and years now. So
Yay.
This is very exciting. Well, I guess, the cat's kind of out of the bag. We're talking about TV, TV and queerness on TV. So I don't want to beat around the bush. We can jump right into it. I read your book recently, Hi Honey, I'm Homo. Mm-hmm. Incredible read. Fantastic. I personally read it in a single sitting. I just could not put it down. But I think I may have noticed something when you were kind of going through the history of all these different shows. And it seems like there might be a couple of like distinct periods where these shows kind of fall into. So for example, or at least, and you can correct me if this isn't
Your intention.
if I had like a weird read on it. But it seems like there were some really early shows that very just kind of gently introduced the, audience to queer concepts like Bewitched, which is basically just an entire gay allegory. And then, All in the Family. And then 5 to 10 years later, there's like a new period where they start to sort of dive a little deeper on those, but they're still playing into stereotypes a little bit. They're not being, really analytical about it. They're starting to explore kind of, but they don't want to like alienate viewers. It's not, it's not TV for queer audiences yet until we get to like the 90s. And then it starts being like queer folks are really involved in like the making of these shows. And so they're telling their own stories for our community. Do you get that same kind of like periods? Or is that something that I just kind of made up in my brain?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And part of that is that TV, and a lot of different like social movements and everything, and the way that we express ourselves goes through these like shifts where there's a real tug of war that makes it easy to kind of outline where those periods fall. So like there's an advance and then there's kind of a pullback, and then there's an advance and then there's a pullback. And so, yeah, exactly like you're saying, there's this period where very gently queer people are starting to be just acknowledged and like asserting their existence, and often it's not even queer people doing it. It's straight allies who are asserting their existence, and sometimes not allies complaining about their existence. So there's that period, kind of 60s into 70s. Then there's a bit of a backlash in the 80s for various reasons we could get into, but then gradually there's more of an exploration and more of an assertion, and this time it's coming much more from queer people until we get to the point where it's not so much that like it's the very special episode with the gay guest of the week. It's just, oh yeah, there's some gay people here. In the same way that, it might be weird to call out like there's a left-handed character or something like that, where it's just completely natural that there's some queer people in the mix, and it's not so much like the special thing that needs like extra consideration. We need to call in the board of review to make sure that we're handling it okay. It's just a part of life.
Right.
So yeah, there are definitely those little windows where we move forward, we move back, we move forward, we move back. And we've had, right now, in this moment that we're living in 2025, we've had like 20 or so years of pretty good moving forward. And I think we're in a period where there's a lot of rhyming history that gives us some cues as to how we might deal with this current moment that we're in.
And Matt, your book looks at like different shows, different periods in time in which there is that push forward. Do you have like a favorite time in which that was moving forward? Is there anywhere that you're like, oh, that period was the best period out there?
You know, no period in history I'm going to say is like, that's the time I would want to live in, because, it's very easy to idealize, and then, it's like, but what about all the dysentery or whatever, like there's problems too. Mm-hmm. But I will say there's a very fun moment in the late 70s when there was this thing called the Family Viewing Hour, where very arbitrarily it was determined that controversial content couldn't appear in prime time on the coasts. And then, but it could appear in prime time, like an hour after prime time in the mountain zones. Like, it was ridiculous. Like, they were trying to like clean up television, and it was such a mess, and it was so like bizarrely applied. It's like when you see food that's like all natural. What does that even mean?
Right.
Like, what does it mean? Like, it's family viewing. What? But anyway, it made it very difficult for lots of different, what would have been then called controversial, but was really just, often, not always, but often a marginalized group just wanting to be represented fairly. Mm-hmm. It made it difficult for that content to exist. And then that all got overturned. There was a big legal fight over it. It was very strange, like the very strange bedfellows of this. It's like Norman Lear and the Larry, I forget his last name, the creator of MASH, and Mary Tyler Moore, and like entertainment figures that probably would never be in a room together. They challenge this thing, it gets overturned, and then there's this very delighted explosion of queerness around 76, in the fall season in 76. And, the late 70s was a great time for sexual exploration and being very adventurous and daring, both in real life, but also in movies and television. Mm-hmm. Then there's a real conservative pushback in the 80s. So a lot of that stuff goes away. But there was some really fun. There was some really fun and very sexy television being made in the 70s, in the late 70s.
Yeah.
Gonna have to go check it out.
Yeah. So for anyone that's not kind of familiar with the history of queerness in TV, would you mind taking us through kind of a brief history of queerness in TV?
Yeah. Well, I mean, to be really brief about it, because, I could write a whole book about it, and I did.
And you did.
The highlights are, television roughly kinda followed the same sort of censorship that movies were doing, and I think people might be more familiar with that, like the Hays Code, which prohibited all kinds of stuff, like for sure deviant sexuality, as they would have called it, but also stuff like movies weren't allowed to show characters being rude to priests, like stuff like that. And so television generally, there was a broadcaster's code that kind of followed the same thing, and so it was nearly impossible for anything broadcast, television or radio, to acknowledge directly queerness. At most, you might get like a rude joke about like Christine Jorgensen or something like that.
Right.
Maybe. And, it would probably be unscripted. There's like this clip of Bob Hope making a Christine Jorgensen joke, for example. There's very little. And so what little exists has to be sort of like hinted at around the margins and kind of, coded, but so heavily that, it's oblique to the point of being completely, missable. So you get shows, for example, in the 1960s, like I think Bewitched is a good starting point to really talk about like queer representation, even though there wasn't anything explicit. Like, this is a family show that it would have been too daring, too bold. They would have never been allowed to like talk about a same-sex couple or anything like that. So instead, there's just kind of a queer frisson to a lot of the characters. Like, Paul Lynde is on there, obviously. Right. And Dora, her mother, Samantha's mother, has a very draggy, over-the-top, flamboyant sort of vibe. So there are also episodes of Bewitched, because the show is, as controversial as a mainstream sitcom, primetime sitcom could be at the time. It's about a sort of a mixed marriage in that one is mortal and one is a witch. And they use that as sort of a tool to talk about issues that they couldn't comfortably broach otherwise. Kind of similar to Star Trek. How Star Trek looks like it's all aliens in space, but really it's about like the conditions on, in our lives right now. Right. So you get these kind of oblique shows, these metaphorical shows. I think there's an argument to be made about Mr. Ed, a show created by a gay man about, a man who has a secret male companion that his wife must not find out about. Like, I think you can really stretch and try to say that there's something queer going on there. Mm-hmm. But then we get to the 1970s, and Norman Lear just completely turns everything on its head by telling his writers, I want shows about what your families are talking about at the dining room table. I want you to open the newspaper and write about that stuff. And the the network was just beside themselves with anxiety about this. Basically, this is 1972 when All in the Family debuts, and I think it was CBS, runs a disclaimer at the start of the first broadcast, essentially saying, like, we have nothing to do with this show, and if you watch it, it's your problem, and you probably shouldn't. Like, really trying to distance themselves from this thing.
Wow.
And the show is not very successful in its first season, but then it's rerun over the summer, and word gets around, like, have you seen this show that's talking about the Vietnam War and homosexuals and, it's a black family that lives next to the white family, and they talk about race and labor movement, and, we're going from, like, My Mother the Car to All in the Family, where it's no longer, as Danny Arnold, who created Barney Miller, says, it's not a show where people, somebody dies and comes back as a ball of butter. We're just talking about it. We're just like, it's there it is.
Right.
And then into the 70s, you start to see shows that can really talk about issues. A lot of them are Norman Lear, but a lot of them are, Barney Miller, I think, is another good example, or Alice, for example. And then, so queer people are present, but boy, oh boy, our understanding of gender and sexuality and stuff is relatively, compared to today,
narrow.
It's narrow, yes. It's rudimentary. The terminology is very unfixed.
Right.
You get shows, for example, like Soap, that really doesn't seem well-meaning, but doesn't seem to understand the difference between being gay and being trans.
Sure.
And then there's a real vanishing act that happens in the 1980s. Ronald Reagan gets elected. There's an HIV epidemic. It's very difficult for shows to find a comfortable way to talk about queer issues because, so much of it is involved in a group that is very unfavored at the moment and also is associated with this very frightening disease. Mm-hmm. There's sort of a disappearance of queer stuff in the 80s, not entirely, but somewhat. And then in the 90s, there's a lot more. I think the activism around HIV extends into other causes. And so you see, the March on Washington in 92, which is very much about the epidemic, but also, there's a child custody and military service and marriage is in the mix. And,
right.
There's much more happening in the 90s. And that gets reflected on television in shows like Rock, which has a same-sex wedding ceremony or relationship recognition ceremony. Eventually, some other shows get there, like Friends and Roseanne. Ellen, of course, happens, and that opens the door for Will and Grace. And suddenly, there's gays everywhere you look. We get to Glee, and that's, one of every kind of queer you could imagine.
Did you just say that Ellen opened the door for Will and Grace? What?
Well, I would say, yeah, that, Ellen coming out was a messy affair, but I don't think Will and Grace could possibly have happened if Ellen hadn't, maybe flown a little closer to the sun than the show ought to have. Wow. But, it showed that this can happen. People are willing to watch a show like this. When Will and Grace began, before it started airing, there was a lot of disbelief. There's a lot of people saying, like, this is never going to work. Ellen lasted, she got canceled after the coming out season, and people aren't going to want to see a same-sex kiss, or you're going to have a same-sex kiss, blah, blah, blah. And so there was kind of this, like, Ellen curse hanging over Will and Grace that, like, the show happened, it was a big thing, it got Super Bowl numbers, and then everybody fled. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so, but I think there was still a belief that, okay, this one show did it, maybe another show could do it, maybe they could do it in a different way. And I think the real innovation with Will and Grace is that ampersand, that it's Will and Grace. It's a show for the gays, it's a show for the straights, there's a balance between the two.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
It's not, all lesbian all the time, although there's certainly room for that. And so I think that's why Will and Grace was a little more comfortable for mainstream viewers.
Interesting.
How much of that, cancellation of Ellen's show was due to the actual audience not being interested after the coming out episode, or just the, like, advertisers being scared away?
Mm-hmm.
I think homophobia, especially in the 1990s, is a rich tapestry. And so there, I think, is a mix of things. One is ABC really turned on the show, like, bizarrely, because Ellen DeGeneres, the actress and comedian, mm-hmm. did not want to come back. She wanted that coming out episode to be like
the finale.
We did it, folks. Goodbye.
Wow.
And I think that's great showmanship. I think that's great timing. Yeah. What are you going to do after that? But she did not have control over, the contract that she had, did not give her the authority to say, I'm not doing another season. ABC said, hey, look, we got 30 million people. It was more than that. It was 40 something million watched some portion of the episode.
Right.
I don't know if that's 40 million that were tuned in that night, because that would be wild.
Yeah.
Just a tremendous number of people watched that episode. episode, ABC's like, all right, you're coming back whether you like it or not. But then in the next season, I think that's season 5, there's parental advisories. They move it to 9:30. Advertisers are dropping out. And, the show just does not have the support of the network, in particular does not have the support of Bob Iger, who's running the show at ABC at that point.
Right.
And so I think there's that.
As they're talking about Ellen, I also remember there was a lot of controversy around Rosie O'Donnell as well. Do you have any insights on that? Like, that comes to my mind as you talk about this time in queer cinema history.
It is such a frustrating time for queer people to exist on television because there is this amazing clip of Ellen and Rosie O'Donnell talking together. It's on Rosie O'Donnell's talk show. Ellen comes on. It's the summer before Ellen's coming out episode. And this was a tortured process. Like Ellen, basically, at the start of the summer, she goes to ABC. Ellen goes to ABC and says, I want to come out next season. I want to do it in November. At the beginning of the season. The rest of the season is me coming to terms with it. And then, we call it quits. And so that just takes months of approvals and meeting. It's hard enough to come out as anything. Now imagine you have to get the Walt Disney Corporation's permission to do it.
Right.
So
Yikes.
she's going through this torturous process. Meanwhile, gossip is leaking. Everybody knows that this is in the works. And also Ellen has just a new comedy album that she's promoting. So she's out on tour over the summer promoting this comedy album, but all anyone wants to talk about is this thing that no one is allowed to talk about.
Right.
So she goes on Rosie and she has this joke that she uses. Ellen has a joke that she uses on a couple of different talk shows where she's like, oh, no, there's a mistake. Like on Letterman, she says something like, we introduced a character named Lesbian, and that was the misunderstanding. And on Rosie, she says, oh, no, there's been a mistake. My character discovers that she's Lebanese. And Rosie's like, hey, I think I might be Lebanese. I like Baba Ganoush. I like Casey Kasem. And Ellen's like, I always thought you might be Lebanese. I always suspected that about you. Yeah. Everybody knows what we're talking about, folks.
Right.
Just say, it's like 97 or 96 or 97. Just say the word. Come on.
I know.
Right.
But we just, we can't say it. And, there's a lot of, we know now that Ellen can be a person for whom it is difficult for many people to work comfortably around. And, on one hand, this isn't to excuse somebody being a difficult boss, but I can understand the stress and the toll. Like, I can't even begin to imagine the, psychological toll of working in an industry, being at the top of your field, being very powerful, and yet...
Yeah.
This thing that you want to talk about, you're still being told you can't talk about this thing that's fundamental to your life. I don't need to tell you folks, how frustrating that must be.
Yeah, it's incredibly frustrating. So I watched your Friends episode on YouTube, and I noticed that some of the things that you were talking about in that was how they were just so afraid to say the word gay. And it's interesting that in the 90s, it's like they're so afraid to say the word lesbian. And now it's like I'm finding that in modern day, the advertisers or the marketing of the show, like in Star Trek you mentioned earlier, right? Like it was a huge deal to have a trans person on that show, but in the show no one acknowledged it. Like it wasn't a thing that they talked about, but in the marketing you bet their butt they did. So it's just interesting to see how these parallels exist, throughout our modern day. And even today, people we don't acknowledge that there are trans people in this show unless it's overtly queer, in which case it's okay.
Star Trek's an interesting one because obviously, set in depending on which one you're looking at, 24th century. And, it's supposed to be this utopia where we don't care about that stuff anymore. And it's not a big deal if someone, there's every flavor of gender and sexuality it can be, and we all accept everything. And so nobody, they can't acknowledge the existence of contemporary, our homophobia and transphobia and all that stuff.
Right.
But the stuff that exists outside the canon of the show, the marketing, of course it can talk about it's a big deal that this exists.
Yeah.
I remember in the 90s when the Jadzia Dax character, I think it was in Starlog or some other magazine, referred to her as pansexual.
Whoa.
And that's not exactly the right term, but at least they were going for, they were at least talking about.
They were trying.
There's something here that isn't like the other characters.
Wasn't there an episode of The Next Generation where Dr. Crusher was very much humanity's not ready for like transness yet, but maybe one day we will be. And it's like, what? You're like replicating food out of nothing. Like transness you can't handle?
Right. This is, one of those examples. Star Trek's usually very good about this, but not always. It like I was saying, it's always a reflection of the time that it's made. So, it frustrates me when there's science fiction that is very focused on anticipating the technological changes, but not the sociological changes. Yeah. And so,
right.
Star Trek doesn't get a full pass on this because, you watch the original series and most of the women are, in secretarial roles, and virtually never do any two women ever speak to each other on the original series. It's wild. If you watch that...
I have watched the original series recently. It's fascinating. It's very, very misogynist. Women only talk to men. They never talk to each other. It's wild. But yes, there is that episode, and it's a little muddled because on one hand you could say, oh, this character, basically, a crew member falls in love with this character who's presenting as male because of sci-fi alien reasons. By the end of the episode, they're presenting as female, and the crew member, our hero character, says, I can't keep up with these changes, and maybe someday, our capacity to love won't be so limited. And I think it'd be fine if she's like, this is too much for me, but she essentially says, this is too much for my species.
Yeah.
And really condemning humanity to a level of intolerance that should not exist. But, this is a show being made by people in the 1990s, and, it's, being viewed, written through their lens.
This episode is funded by our Patreon.
Yeah, only because the Illuminati won't return my emails.
Help us thrive without money from corporate overlords. Patreon.com/.fem. That's patreon.com/DOTFEMME.
You think I should send them another one?
Hit the send button again, Danny. Try one more time.
It's interesting going through and looking at like the history of queerness in television and really kind of seeing how, and especially in the 90s, like late 90s, early 2000s, because it like accelerates exponentially, but just like the acceptance of like queer identities and how like TV seemed to be so instrumental in making that public shift. As a personal example, like I came out as trans to my family in 2015 when I started my transition 10 years ago. And when like I grew up in Kansas, socially liberal family, but still like Catholic in the Midwest, so I wasn't entirely sure how this was going to go over when I came out to my family, but it went surprisingly well, really smoothly. And years later, like a few years ago, I was talking to my mom about like, where did that kind of come, because like, everything we know from like American Midwest Catholic culture would suggest that I should not have had a good reaction, but I did. And so it was like, where did that come from? And my mom didn't know or realize consciously, but through that conversation, we sort of realized she grew up with her siblings and my grandparents watching Bewitched and like Norman Lear shows. And so I really do think that a big part of like my Volga German grandparents and my mom, were so accepting of me coming out as trans because they had slowly been like incepted to accepting queer identity through the use of TV.
Yeah, it's true that the visibility is great for queer people to see ourselves, and also it's a great little lesson for straight people. There's, for example, an episode of Will and Grace where Jack comes out to his mother, who somehow didn't know. And, he says something about, like, I've been keeping this a secret, and that's wrong because it makes it seem like something I'm ashamed of. And, I hope this doesn't disappoint you, blah, 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 blah. He comes out. And she says, she's a little stunned at first. And then she says, oh, I could never be disappointed in you. And like, it's a really nice line. It's a really lovely coming out. And then we go back to the jokes. But there is a little moment of real, genuinely lovely, here's how to react when someone comes out to you. And then, not to say that Will and Grace invented that, because, years earlier on The Golden Girls, there's an episode where a friend of Dorothy's comes to visit and she develops a crush on Rose. Rose doesn't know how to react at first. But then by the end of the episode, Rose says, essentially, I'm not sure I understand these feelings, but if I did understand them and if I was like you, I would be flattered that you thought of me that way. Aww. Like, that is the nicest way to respond.
Yeah.
And good grief. Like, it's sometimes, the straight people just need to be told, like, they really have to have their hands held so they know what to do.
They need to be told that it's okay to, be accepting and like, like face challenges, feel different in that, feel a little uncertain, a little like a little scared, frankly. Like, there's fear and uncertainty, in the unfamiliar. And if we start to help people recognize that that's okay to feel that, it's okay to feel a little bit of that shame, to work through it on your own pace and your own time, then, maybe we can find a little bit of that representation in film and cinema as well.
Yeah.
I think of I'm sure you've seen the clip of RuPaul on Jimmy Kimmel where they're talking about like Ru's on the cover of a magazine and Jimmy Kimmel says something like first drag queen on the cover of Vogue or whatever magazine it was.
Oh, yeah.
And Ru goes, a drag queen, like
That's
offended.
Right.
A drag queen. And the look of terror on Jimmy Kimmel's face. Like, what did I say? Why is this wrong? What have I done? It's on camera. And then Ru goes, I am the queen of drag.
That's right.
Like, I love that she gives Jimmy Kimmel this like heart attack on camera because, like there are, I think generally speaking, people want to say the right thing most of the time. The good people want to be good people and they might be scared. Like, I think one of the things that's nice about the clip is that he genuinely does seem scared, like he might have said the wrong thing. And if he was, there's a much worse way that it could have gone where, I don't know, it could have been more South Parky where he'd been like, yeah, that's right, whatever the hell you are, something mean. Right. But he doesn't. Right. He doesn't. He's genuinely worried. And maybe he's worried because he's like, this just reflects poorly on me. What is this going to do to my reputation? But, at least the fear is there.
Yeah, I think you have a point that it is, like visibility is good for straight people, but also, like you said, it's good for us too. Because, like I just mentioned that I came out 10 years ago in 2015 when I was 25, but I had the opportunity to like transition when I was 15 years old. And I didn't take that opportunity because I didn't know that was a real thing I could do. My only exposure to like being not just trans, but queer in general was like on the days I stayed home from school catching like a weird episode of like Maury Povich. Oh yeah. Where, they were like, guess, who's trans and who's not kind of episode. Or when I saw the very rare trans celebrity like Chaz Bono in the tabloids. So like to me, being trans wasn't like a real thing normal people could do. It was a thing that like if you were rich and could afford to do it, or if you were like a sex worker with a sugar daddy bankrolling you, or like whatever it was, So when I think back to like when I was 15 years old and my mom pulled me aside and was like, do you want to be a girl? Like, is that a thing you want to do? And I adamantly and vehemently told her no. And that was the end of it, for 10 more years. And it's like, if I had done that at 15, it would have completely changed my life for the better. Had I just known, had I just seen these examples that were just like regular people, living regular lives, and it wasn't such a deviant thing to do. Yeah.
Do you think that in modern cinema today, modern film and TV, that we're getting enough trans representation at this time? Or do you think that like it could be improved? Do you think Dany would have come out at 15 if we had the modern, equivalent of today's TV to look back on and reflect with?
That's a great question. As far as I'm concerned, there's never enough queerness until everyone's queer. Like we've had almost 100 years of almost every character being straight and heterosexual and cisgender. So I think now we're due for a century of broadcast media where everyone's queer. Yeah. I think that's what would work for me.
That'd be great.
That is the queer agenda, I believe.
It is, yes. But no, I don't think there's enough. I think, being totally serious, I think that we're looking at a time when we're probably going to see a little bit less. It reminds me a lot of what happened in the early 80s. Sure. Yeah. Where, a lot of places where a lot of shows and networks were like, it's not worth the trouble. We're going to get complaints. We want to appeal to the broadest audience we can, and people are sensitive. So we're just, this isn't a fight for us, as the producers of, I don't know, CSI, whatever, we can't be bothered.
Right.
So I do think that is a real risk. And I think part of the problem is exactly, Dany, what you described, not seeing enough variety in the ways that a person can live a queer life. So, if you're watching in the 90s, it's, Maury Povich featuring sex workers and, or it's some rich celebrity or something like that. Or, it's somebody that might not resonate with you. I mean, similarly, we think of the early 2000s as being, post Will and Grace and post Ellen and all that stuff as being a good time. But, even for representations of gay characters, a lot of it was pretty narrow. I'm doing this project with Brokeback Mountain right now because it's about to be the 20th anniversary. And I'm looking back at the representations of, just gay men at the time. And one of the reasons that Brokeback was so novel was, there's just this marveling that gay and cowboy together, even though they're shepherds, not cowboys, whatever. But
right.
these two very different things that shouldn't go together, because there's so much of it is like Big Gay Al on South Park, or, bless his heart, Chris Colfer on Glee, or, just like whenever there's a gay character, even in the 90s, or like Queer Eye, they're fancy, they're single, they're here to teach the straight people a lesson. There's limits on what gay can be, even on Will and Grace. You've got Jack and you've got Will, and that is a pretty narrow definition of what the queer experience can be.
I remember my dad telling me about Brokeback Mountain growing up, and it's interesting to hear that you say this now, because he would tell me not to watch that show, right? And I don't think it was him saying that so much, but the general way that society viewed that piece of cinema at that time. It wasn't received well among the cis straight male population. And so, the commentary that he was receiving as well in that media was, oh, don't watch that. That's not for you. You don't want to see that.
I will say, looking back at the media from that time, there is just, and I'm revisiting my own writing from 2005, and there's just the jokes were relentless, and some of them are fine. Some of them are jokes that if a queer person told them, I'd be like, good one.
Yeah.
But it just the word Brokeback became such a punchline.
Huge.
And I was feeling very sensitive about it at the time because, my perception was anytime mainstream is talking about anything gay, it's to make fun of us.
Yeah.
And, even if that wasn't the intent, Jon Stewart has some jokes about it on the Oscars and Tina Fey has some jokes about it on Saturday Night Live. And these are not people who have a malicious bent towards the queers, but, it's hard not to feel like you got to be really on guard for if someone's talking about Brokeback, they're about to say something mean.
And then you parallel that with the sexualization of women around that time too. And then you just get this massive, it's just, it doesn't feel representative of anything today. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting to look back on. And as you're saying, some of the shows from the 70s, I'm like, oh yeah, that feels like some of the things that, we would talk about today, right? There was progress in many of the queer shows and queer representation. Mm-hmm. And then, we kind of look back at the early 2000s where I don't know, I feel personally there was a little bit of a pullback, as you were talking about earlier.
There's this very weird phenomenon late 90s, early 2000s where popular media knows that they can't tell gay jokes like they used to, and they can't be too mean about it. Right. But you can really place a movie or TV show in time by if something kind of gay happens, and there's this way of looking befuddled. The best example that I can think of is in one of the Austin Powers'. It's a scene with Beyonce, and Beyonce is talking to Austin Powers through Nathan Lane for some reason. And so Nathan Lane is repeating whatever Beyonce is saying. And there's this moment of romance between Nathan Lane's character and Mike Myers' character. And Beyonce gives them this the look, there's something gay about you. Just that what? And there's just this little 7-year window or so where they're just, they want, you can see somebody wants to tell a gay joke, but they know they can't.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
they can only look. They can only just look.
Yeah, absolutely.
So here's a question I have for you that maybe you can help me wrap my mind around sort of what's happening today. But we talked a lot about this kind of moments of progress and then some pullback and how it seems to be kind of cyclical. Mm-hmm. And I think you're right. I think we are experiencing this moment of pullback, especially around trans issues right now. But does it, because I I'm only 35, so I haven't been around for a lot of these cycles, so it's hard for me to gauge. And maybe it's hard for you to gauge too, I don't know. But like, does this one feel different? Or do you think there's reason to be hopeful that we're going to have another like queer and trans explosion, in the next like 5 years or something?
That's a great question. Impossible to predict the future, but I think what feels different is that we've had so much good progress. Like we've had so long, basically from like the beginning of the 2000s with like, just in media stuff like, Queer Eye and Glee and Modern Family and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And legally with marriage and military service and, health. There's been basically 2 pretty good decades. And now I think hostility towards queer stuff, especially towards, anything trans, I think is so stark because so many people have just, there are adults who have never known a time when things didn't just always get better.
Right.
Or they might have been kids, I'm thinking of like 2008 when Prop 8 passed and California has marriage equality and then they don't because the voters passed this thing. For me, that was a big shock because I was used to things always getting better. And then suddenly we lose marriage equality. Wait, you mean we can lose things? And so that was a real wake up for me. And I think for a lot of people, because you saw a real explosion of activism around that, I think for there to be like a really strong, backlash to the backlash, for there to be like a movement for like, queer liberation, I think what that might take, unfortunately, is some big event. Like, Prop 8 passing was a big mobilizer for a lot of people in 2008.
Sure.
The HIV epidemic was a big mobilizer over a long period of time. And so I don't know, I think it's a little early to say right now if we're seeing, the backlash, to, for example, trans women in sports, like if the hostility that they're facing right now, like, is that sufficient to mobilize people? I'm not sure. I would love it if it was, but
I'm keeping a very close eye on this Canadian case right now. There's a trans woman who's seeking asylum in Canada. It's less that she's seeking asylum and more that she's petitioning the Canadian government to recognize a refugee status for trans people. And if Canada does recognize trans people as refugees, I think that terminology is right. If trans people are recognized as refugees in Canada, then that itself will set major precedent for a lot of U.S. politics, a lot of world politics about what's happening in the U.S. And so that case is something that I'm very, very interested in.
Yeah. I think the big question there is, will that escape queer containment? Like, will the mainstream, will large numbers of people who wouldn't otherwise care about this stuff, will they find out about this and will they care?
Right. Yeah. I don't know. It's interesting. I gotta say... It does make me a little nervous to think that like what we need in order to like make a good positive rebound is like another Stonewall level moment, because that's, that's pretty scary because you think about like a lot of the Stonewall level moments we've had in the past, they've been pretty violent. I mean, that's the reason we celebrate Pride in June is to, honor the people that like suffered and died at Stonewall. Cause like people did not get out of Stonewall unscathed. It was a protest, so it's like, that is kind of scary to think that we need something,
radical
at that level.
Yeah. I'm certainly not saying like, boy, we just need more suffering. Like,
sure.
For sure. I'm not saying like we need a calamity. That could be, that is one way that, people suddenly are activated. However, it's not the only way. Like, I'm also looking at folks like the Gay Activists Alliance in the 1970s. Here's a group of people who were fed up with sort of just like the low boiling simmer of homophobia of the time. And so not so much in response to like some big cataclysm, it was partially, inspired by Stonewall, but not completely. People start getting together and saying, we need to take more action. We need to be more aggressive. And so they created the conditions by which mainstream was forced to pay attention to them. They would go in and they'd take over government offices, or they'd get a whole bunch of tickets to the opera so they could confront Mayor Lindsay like in public when he goes to the opera. They knew how to grab headlines, and those tactics eventually turned into a lot of things that ACT UP made use of. But even before the epidemic was happening, in the 1970s, you've got folks in the GAA or Lesbian Feminist Alliance who would say, they wouldn't wait for, I don't know, like a bombing at a gay bar or something horrible like that.
Right.
It didn't need there didn't need to be a tragedy. They could just hijack. They'd go on like the Dick Cavett show and stand up and disrupt the show, for example.
Okay.
Like they would have a grievance, they'd have demands, they knew it would get attention, they were willing to get arrested if that's what it called for. So, basically, just getting attention and like knowing what will get the right kind of attention was kind of an art form, I think, for a lot of the protest groups in the 1970s.
Yeah.
And again, this is not, I don't want to sugarcoat and say like they were great. They were all doing great work because there were a lot of bad ones too.
Sure.
And there were a lot of like movements and efforts and things that just went nowhere. But there were occasionally those times, and they had this whole like playbook. They had this an actual like how to get attention workbook that they would like distribute to activist groups around the country. Start by writing letters to the editor. That probably isn't going to get any attention, but you can say that you tried and it didn't work. And now you can escalate and you can stage a protest, and it can be a polite protest. And then if that doesn't work, now you have the excuse to stage a disruptive one.
Can you send that to me? That'd be great.
Yeah, I can actually. It is, very frustratingly, it is not online. I've been meaning to make it a project to put the PDF online, but I literally had to go to a physical archive. Yale University has this in their like rare books collection. Wow. Was able to go photograph page by page, and so
that's awesome.
I think there's a lot to learn from those very disruptive tactics. They called them zaps, where they would like take over a TV studio or something like that.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot to learn from those zaps back in the 70s.
There needs to be some pressure within the community itself as well as external, and then both factors need to have like some type of catalyst. Mm-hmm. Just having like a day of unity. Right. Connecting with a bunch of different nonprofits, a bunch of different individuals, working on finding community across state lines where we all come up, where we all say, the things that are the things that we're struggling with as a country, as a minority group within this country.
I 100% agree. And what is crucial about that kind of stuff, what we've seen, like, I'm very focused on media and, television and film, and like how people have used that technology to advance liberation.
Yeah.
What is often missing from those efforts is, the marketing and the packaging and getting people to give a shit. Because it's very, a day of unity is something that is for a lot of people going to be very easy to ignore. Mm-hmm. And so often, the very good work is unfortunately undercut by by its own importance and its own like dignity, honestly, what is required. And this doesn't need to be, completely coordinated, but it's great if it is some stuff that, just can't be ignored, something disruptive, so, something that is going to get attention.
Exactly.
And I think, it can be reactive. It can be something, we're reacting to Prop 8 or we're reacting to here in Seattle. We just had like this really awful, I don't know what to call it. It was like a show. It was a concert in like the park in the middle of the neighborhood.
It was like an anti-trans Christian rock concert in the neighborhood park. Yeah.
And we can be reactive to stuff like that. And I think that we should have a response to it. But I think it's even stronger if we have something even better that we did. And Agreed. It's not us like responding to something, it's us creating something. So, whatever form that takes, whether it's angry or whether it's welcoming and exciting, I think getting the attention is what's crucial. That's what you see on, whether it's sitcoms, like having a gay episode, those often are not reactive. They're not responding to something else, but they're great and exciting and wonderful, like the Friends having a gay marriage episode, for example.
Right.
Stuff like that like gets people attention, is exciting and shocking and you can't ignore it. That's the kind of stuff that I think is often missing from the important work.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does oftentimes feel kind of like a lost art form.
Spectacle. We should be good at that.
Yeah, we should. Isn't that what everyone expects?
Mm-hmm. We love to put on a show.
So, Matt, the thing that I wanted to ask you before we start to wrap up here, you're talking about all these things in cinema. You're talking about parallels to today. We're talking about historical push and pulling. So you obviously look at film very differently than most other people. And I wanted to ask if there's something that you wish other people would see in film that other people just don't quite see. What do you read between the lines with?
Gosh, what a great question. Often when I'm looking at a movie, you know, I take a very queer lens to it, but also, you know, I'm often thinking about like, what are the actual real people's lives that are being reflected in this? Like, how does this affect real people's lives, or how does it reflect? How does it affect and how does it reflect, I guess, is how I'm looking at it. I was talking to somebody yesterday about the, you know, the videos that I make and the book that I wrote. And we were talking about like Dog Day Afternoon, actually. We were talking about the movie Dog Day Afternoon. And a movie with some really interesting depictions of the trans experience of the early 1970s. And so the person I was talking to said, I know that this movie is a product of its time, but why is it a product and how is it a product? Like, like, what does that mean to say it's a product of its time? Like, that's that's a nice thing to know, but what does it mean? And so I think that's kind of the thing that I want people to think about when they look at movies and TV is like, so what's going on in the lives of the people who wrote it, and what's going on in the lives of the people who are like watching it and saying like, oh wait, like, you know, it may be like a dawning realization, like, wait, that's me.
Yeah.
You know, like sometimes you're watching something, you're like, hold on a second. This thing that I thought was just going to be like some silly pulpy sci-fi story, is this about me? And like you can be surprised by that happening. I mean, I you know, I'm working on this thing about Brokeback Mountain, and there's a lot about that movie that at the time I felt was very unrelatable to me, like as a urban gay who doesn't go camping. I'm like, what do these guys' lives have to do with me? And watching it now, 20 years later, I'm like, there's so much more about the story that is about me than I even realized at the time.
Yeah.
So I guess that's what I would say, like, would be great if people could come to movies with is think about like, is it secretly about you, or if not, is it secretly about someone you know?
Yeah.
Where can we watch that Brokeback Mountain?
Yeah, so it should be on my channel. It's youtube.com/Matt Baume, and you can just follow me on social medias. I'm on, you know, for better or for worse, I'm on most of them, and I've got a newsletter you can get on my website, mattbaume.com. It'll all be findable through that.
You're amazing. You're amazing.
Thank you so
and
much.
It's been such a pleasure to listen to you and hear everything that you have to say about queer cinema. I've learned so much, and I can't wait to watch more of your videos. I was riveted by the Friends episode, and I can't wait to dive into more of them. So thank you.
Oh, yay. That's so sweet. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
You guys are amazing too. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on. I hope, you know, we'll have you on again sometime soon.
Looking forward to it.
Cool.
Awesome. Well, I guess we'll wrap it up here. Thank you, everybody, for listening. If you enjoy what we do here, you can support us by going to our website. You can support us financially on patreon.com/.fem. You can find other episodes of this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. That's YouTube, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts. Did I forget any, Claire?
I don't think so. I think that's about it. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you so much for listening, and we will see you next time.